Welcome, everyone, to the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology's Expert Series webcast. Today, we have a very special program, kind of outside of our normal continuing legal education type program, really in the vein of a public service announcement. With us today, we have Miriam Wogmeister from Morrison Foerster. You've seen other programs with us. If you don't know Miriam, you should. She's one of the nation's leading privacy and cybersecurity lawyers, leads the group, an enormous group at Morrison Foerster. So the way I always think about Miriam is when she talks about privacy issues, that cybersecurity issues, people listen because they know they need to understand what she knows. And today we're lucky that she helped craft a program, brought this to our attention. So Miriam, I want to get out of your way and let you introduce your guests and introduce this program.
Thank you so much, Wayne. Um, so if you think you should listen to what I have to say, you really, really should listen to what Brian Bordron has to say. Brian was the former head of the cyber division for the FBI. He saw everything relating to cyber and data security that the FBI had access to. He is now the deputy CISO at Microsoft. And so he has this fantastic wealth of knowledge, both on the private sector and the public sector. The comments that Brian will make today and that I will make today are our own personal comments and should not be attributed to either the FBI or Microsoft. What we want to talk about today is really the implications of the Canvas breach that affected so many schools. So, as you probably know, the 40% of the schools or something like that in the US use Canvas, but lots of schools internationally also use Canvas. It's a program that allows faculty and students and teachers and administrators to communicate with each other about all kinds of things relating to schools. And they had a compromise back in May. And we want to talk about that and what the implications are for you as faculty members, as teachers, as students, with respect to this incident. So with that, Brian,
Mm-hmm.
tell us what happened. Tell us a little bit about
Sure.
the speech to set the stage.
Yeah, thanks, Miriam. Good to see you and join you here. And thanks for sharing the caveat at the top that these are my views. So I think it's important to start with just some definitions, right? And so the name of the company in play here is a company named Instructure. That's an educational technology company. And they publish what's called the Canvas Learning Management System. So as I go through this, Canvas is the tool or the product that suffered, but the company that's in play is named Instructure. And just to orient the audience to that up front. So Shiny Hunters is a cyber criminal group. They've been around since about 2019, and they first gained access to Instructure's systems or their infrastructure on about April 25th of 2026. They did that by exploiting a vulnerability that's called Free for Teacher account program. And it's a feature that essentially allows educators to create Canvas accounts without institutional verification. And so I also have taught over the past couple of years at Johns Hopkins, and Johns Hopkins, uses the Canvas product as well. And it's essentially an interface for students and faculty, students posting assignments, posting syllabus, these types of things, as well as direct messages. And we'll talk about the impact of all that, as we get into this today. The compromise or the exposure window of that Free for Teacher program essentially ran from April 30th of 2026 through May 7th. That's important because it notes the window that data could have been exfiltrated from the environment. On about May 7th, Instructure did rotate privileged credentials, which essentially should have been a deterrent to keep the actors out. I use the word should because I'll share here in just a minute that the actors did overcome that. So on May 3rd, the threat intelligence tracking platform that we know as ransomware.live posted a copy of a ransom letter from Shiny Hunters in which the group claimed to have data from about 275 million individuals across close to 9,000 schools. I think the total school count is around 8,800. Then on May 7th, Canvas login pages at many of these institutions They displayed a message from Shiny Hunters reading, Shiny Hunters has breached Instructure parentheses again, right? But there's more context here, right? Shiny Hunters went on to say that instead of Instructure contacting them to resolve the issue, Instructure essentially just provided some, basic security patches. The validity of that, I don't know how true that is or is not. The key takeaway here, though, is that Shiny Hunters again compromise Instructure. So about one day after that, it appears that Instructure did pay the ransom. Under the agreement, the hackers reportedly returned all the stolen data, the compromised data, and they returned what they call shred logs, which is essentially digital forensics, essentially showing that the data copy that Shiny Hunters had was also destroyed. We will get into this kind of, is it actually viable to believe that Hunters only had one copy of the data? Spoiler alert, no, we have no confidence in that. But nonetheless, they did provide shred logs. I think one important note is that Instructure published some information that they said the agreement that they came to with Shiny Hunters covered all impacted customers. So it's not just an agreement between Instructure and Shiny Hunters, but rather it was an agreement between Instructure and Shiny Hunters and Instructure's 8,800 school customers, and then obviously all the users of the platform.
Wait,
Yeah,
wait,
I'll
wait.
just,
Can I just challenge you
yeah,
on that? Let's just start there. I
yep.
don't think they said that it covered the users. The language was very, very specific. It said, it said you and your customers. The customers are the schools. It does
Correct.
not say anything about the individual students or teachers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
So
we are going to talk
I think
about that.
that's a really, really important point,
Okay.
right? That as we get into it, right? Like what are the implications? Because I don't think Shining Hunters has promised anything with respect to the users.
Okay. And that's a great setup for what we're going to talk about here in just a few
Yeah.
minutes. And let me just close this section, Miriam, with a comment on capability. For people listening to this who are new to the environment or perhaps don't have many years of experience in this environment with cyber criminal actors or just cyber threat actors in general, these individuals are extremely capable. This is their full-time job. It is not a hobby. It is not something they do in the evening hours. This is their job, and they've been highly, highly profitable. I think one key takeaway for the audience is when you're dealing with folks like Shiny Hunters, they are extremely capable. They know their line of work, and you should be respectful of that.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree with you. And obviously let's just talk about Shining Hunters because I think that's a good lead right there to like who
Mhm.
they are. So, normally when we talk about different threat actor groups, we talk about nation state actors, we talk about criminal groups that are financially motivated. But Shiny Hunters doesn't fit into either of those buckets, right? Shiny Hunters isn't a nation state, and they're not particularly financially motivated. So, can you talk a little bit about who they are and what motivates them?
Sure. So, to the best of my knowledge, Shiny Hunters has been around since about 2019, right? They have some traditional overlap with Breached Forums, which is a very well-known ecosystem for cyber criminals in the cyberspace for many years. And there are probably what I would call a parallel set of threat actors to Scattered Spider, which is a very, very well-known actor set that we all are very familiar with. So when you go back several years, when you look at ransomware events or data encryption events, they started as single lever extortions, right? So actors would get into an environment, they would encrypt the environment, and then they would extort the victim, in this case, Instructure, for payment to decrypt the environment. That then moved to essentially a double extortion environment where actors would first get in, they would exfiltrate data, and obviously have that data in their coffers, and then they would encrypt. So now they had two extortion levers. That's continued to evolve, and I think what these threat actors have recognized is that um, the value here is the data, right? Companies and organizations have become better at overcoming encryption events. So the extortion lever is really, really the data. So in this case, it's called a pay or leak model, right? That, essentially Instructure is put in a position that if they don't pay, all of this data will be leaked. And why that's more successful is, right, it doesn't require the extra level effort of the encryption event, but also it's a doesn't trigger the kind of operational disruption that draws law enforcement action immediately, such as a ransomware event. I do think the timing was deliberate and calculated, right? And I think, we've seen this and we'll talk about power schools in LA school district here today as well a little bit. But the timing was deliberate, right? It was during final exam, a window when institutions are really, really dependent on the platform, and that puts maximum pressure on in this case, Instructure to pay. Their communications from Shiny Hunters designed to maximize institutional leverage, right? They list organizations like Harvard and Stanford and Columbia and other elite institutions to show maximal reputational pressure. I think just taking another step back on Shiny Hunters, this is not their only line of work, right? Instructure, right? They are actively selling stolen data sets to other ransomware affiliates, exceeding $1 million per company, right? So we'll get into this more here in just a second, but like the scope of the Canvas data with this combination of student PII, private messages, institutional email addresses, just a treasure trove for cyber criminals. So that's who Shiny Hunters is.
Well, and I totally agree with everything you said. Just adding a little bit, like
Mhm.
when I'm saying that they're not financially motivated, their goal, just like Scattered Spider, is to get as much attention and to cause as much disruption. Like you said, this was calculated to be finals week because it wasn't just about, yeah, I mean, yes, they want to get leak or pay, but what they wanted to do was just make a mess. And by doing this in the middle of finals week, when, like you said, everybody, like schools had to move exams. Schools had to figure out other ways for students to be able to, turn in their papers because all that stuff happens now through Canvas. And so a big part of their goal is to be disruptive, not just to get money. I mean, I think we think, as best we know, right, that these are young folks, right? These are Scattered Spider are not as sophisticated. Not, I mean, they are sophisticated, but they're not kind of I'm going to say professional. Like these tend to be young people who get a kick out of making trouble, right?
They do. I do. The only thing I would nudge back on is they're obviously very interested in making money as well, right? And they have been very successful, right? But yeah, I agree with you. It's all about maximum impact, reputational damage, or in their case, reputational elevation, right? And then making money.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So talk a little bit about what was stolen here. You
Yeah.
mentioned it, but maybe dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. And I think this is really important because it sets up the conversation after this about what can be done with it, right? And what individuals should do to protect themselves. But, just general numbers. The attackers stole about 275 million records, about 3.5 terabytes of data. That's a lot of data, right? I mean, that is not an insignificant amount of data. Contains usernames, email addresses, course names, enrollment information, and messages. I think most concerning
Can
though.
I add what else it includes?
Oh yeah.
Some schools use Canvas for accommodation issues. So, if you need more
Mhm.
time or you need some other kind of accommodation because you have a learning issue, that it's used for that. Some schools use it for disciplinary issues. And then there's the direct messaging. So
Yep.
messages between students and teachers. So there's
Yep.
actually a lot of kind of more it's just not just name and your course and that you got to be right, like it's got a
Yep.
lot of other data in there that's very definitely is private.
Yeah. And I appreciate adding that, Miriam. And the point, let me just draw out one point a little bit further. In terms of these direct messages, right? As Miriam just mentioned, they're student to student DMs, they're student to faculty DMs, measured in several billion records, right? In terms of the message that were intercepted. And to Miriam's perspective, to point about, you're looking at the data, and we'll talk about this, right? Names, institutional email addresses, student ID numbers. You combine that with accommodations, interest, you combine that with direct messages. It allows for great context for threat actors to do highly targeted spear phishing, right? And so that is a significant risk to the individuals who had data stolen from their accounts. And the actors can use that, also for account takeover attempts and then downstream identity fraud. But the context that Miriam's talking about here is extremely, extremely important to the threat actors because whether they use the data or they sell the data for use, it allows highly targeted operations against individuals. That individuals meaning at like me or Miriam.
Right.
And one
Exactly.
other one other note here is there's a new law that came into law in, I believe, late April of 2026. So it's only about, 40 days old. It's called the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And it's a federal law essentially designed to give parents control over the personal information that websites, apps, online services collect from children under 13 years of age. So Canvas and Instructure, they serve many elementary schools and high schools. They obviously serve colleges as well, meaning that a lot of the affected individuals may be minors, right? And this leads to significant exposure under that new law. And so for anybody not familiar with that, again, it's referred to in short as COPPA, COPPA, but it stands for Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. It's worth reading about as parents out there to understand what the federal law says. And then, Miriam, I'm just going to close this portion with a scope, right? Like we talked about this 3.5+ terabytes of data, everything from personally identifiable information to direct messages to context on course content, right? And I mean, the scope is not only voluminous, but it is broad enough to enable a lot of onward activity by cyber criminals. And I know we'll talk about that here in just a
Yeah.
second.
I totally agree with you. And I would say it a different way. There are 275 million potential victims, right? Like because
Mhm.
every single person whose data was in there, whether it's trivial or it's more private, is a potential victim. And we know that one of the things that Shiny Hunters is really good at is figuring out how to find new victims based on the data that they've stolen. We've seen Shiny Hunters do that in prior cases. We've seen them steal the data, get paid, promise to delete the data, ha
Mhm.
ha ha, and then go and extort individuals. And so maybe Brian, just like maybe talk a little bit about that. Like, what do you
Yeah.
think Shiny Hunters is going to do with the data?
Okay, so let me go out of order from my prep because you just hit a point that I think plays very well. So, number one is individual extortion, right? Um, Shiny Hunters has already begun directly pressuring some of the 8,800 approximately Instructure customers it said fell victim. They're seeking individual payoffs for a promise not to release stolen names, email addresses, etc. And to Miriam's point, this is 100% consistent with what Shiny Hunters did with the Power School compromise in 2024, right? So, where victims received extortion demands even after Power School had paid a ransom. So, to Miriam's point, right, that this guarantee that the data is not available elsewhere is not going to be used like is just nothing that someone should pay attention to. You should assume that if you are in this data set that you're going to be targeted by shiny hunters, whether that's through spear phishing or other extortion attempts. The
Okay,
second thing,
can I just pause right there?
yeah,
So, because there are probably two ways you know that that's to be true, Brian. One is because we've seen it where we've seen victims, but also, hasn't, when the FBI has gone and actually captured infrastructure of people who claim to have deleted the data, you guys, sorry, the FBI found that the data was actually still there, right? So like, they
yeah,
like maybe just talk about that a little bit, just
yeah. I
because there's two
just
ways we know that it's false, right?
Yeah, I just think it is well known, right, in law enforcement. It is well known in the cyber incident response space. It is well known in the cyber forensic space that these quote unquote guarantees that the data has been deleted are simply false, right? And we can prove that over and over through many different experts in the field, right? So yeah, Miriam, I agree with that 100%.
Thank you.
So the next thing I think we want to talk about is just targeted spear phishing at scale. So we've talked about this thematically already, but when actors have this type of exposed data, right? Names, context about the person, student ID numbers, direct messages, courses, accommodations, that is really, really, really powerful to cyber threat actors to enable highly targeted spear phishing and account takeover attempts. So anyone on listening to this should be very, very aware that they could get emails, they could get account reset requests, right? And those likely need to be paid very, very close attention. And we'll talk about what to exactly do about that in the last portion of our conversation. But though the awareness piece for targeted spear phishing is really, really an important takeaway.
So let's just talk about what that might look like, Brian, right? Like what I have seen the type of messages that Shiny Hunters sends to individuals, and it's really, really convincing. Can maybe just talk a little bit about that? Like, what does the note, whether it's an email or a text, like what does it look like, and how do they do it and make it so compelling?
Yep. Yeah, so I mean, I think one quick note here, and Miriam and I know this, the evolution of spear phishing um, has increased in velocity because of AI, right? So gone are the days where people who did not have proficiency in the English language were writing broken English emails to people here in the United States or elsewhere. Now that is all machine generated. And so those targeted spear phishing emails can come from the school that you are currently enrolled in, right? And they would say things like, hey, based on X, Y, and Z, right, we need you to take this action. Please click on this link to fill out this new form for the next school year. That's just a very basic example, but it would look and feel identical to what other messages you have received from the schools. You should really look at the email headers on those messages, right? Who did they come from? Can you guarantee that those email addresses are 100% affiliated with the academic institution you're attending? And just like a really good practice is just like don't click on a URL in an email, don't click on an attachment in an email. You can always email your administrator at your school and say, hey, is this legitimate? But it would look and feel like any other already received messages from the school because the actors have access to what those emails look like, and then they can tailor the emails directly to you based on what they know about you.
Okay, now talk about what's an extortion message going to look like from Shiny Hunters.
Yeah, it's going to say, hey, it could be anything from harassment to escalation, right? It's going to say, hey, I'll give you the worst case scenario. We have compromising videos or compromising photographs of you, what we refer to in the industry as light sextortion, right? Where there's no guarantee that the actors actually have those images or have those videos, but that would be the extreme case of what the actors would claim to have, and that you should pay them to prevent the release of those images or those videos. On a slightly,
Wait, can,
uh,
can I just say that just add up to that one? So
yeah.
what those messages are going to say, it's going to be to a kid and it's going to
Mhm.
say, hey, you go to the, Middlesex High School and you have Mr. Smith as your homeroom teacher and we stole your data. But not only did we get the data from your school, but we got into your phone and your personal computer. And if you don't give us $1,000, we're going to tell your parents and put on the internet that you've been watching porn. Right. So
Correct.
the part is they're going to use the information that they stole from campus and then make up something, the sextortion part, to try and coerce people into paying them money. It's unbelievably effective and super
Mhm.
scary when you get one of those messages, right, Brian?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, that's a really good practical description of what it would look and feel like, Mary. I appreciate you weighing in on that. And yeah, I mean, again, I mean, I'll just say this now. The number one thing for people to do if they, students, especially under the age of 18, right, to do if they receive one of these is do not reply, right? Just pause, take some time to think, engage your parents, even if you think there's risk about personal reputation for yourself. Like, just pause, engage your parents, engage law enforcement, right? And do not reply. But Miriam, you did a great job explaining what it would look and feel like, just using the data that they have. certainly one could assume that there is inappropriate conversation in all of these direct messages that students or faculty may not want out in the open world from a reputational damage perspective. That's just another spin on what Miriam described as what a extortion note would look like to gain leverage over you. But again, the key takeaway here is like pause, right? Do not reply immediately. Do not panic, right? Pause, engage your parents, engage law enforcement, and let's walk through this with all of you.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. But the other thing is, they promised to have deleted it. They, in theory, sent proof that they deleted it, and yet they're using that information to extort you, which means even if you were to pay them, it will mean nothing. They are
Mhm.
not going to delete the data. They're going to do whatever they're going to do to keep getting leverage. And if you are one of the people who replies to them, and this goes to your point about using AI, right? It's also you have 275 million potential victims. So they're going to use AI to do auto-generated extortion notes, likely. I mean, I would, use a bot to do that. I think that's what I would do if I were them. And so that whoever replies is going to be the one that moves to the top of the pack and the one that they're going to then potentially be more serious about trying to extort. I mean, Brian, isn't
Yep.
that what you think is going to happen?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would, yes, they are not to be trusted, right?
Right.
So even if they tell you that, you pay and this all goes away, it's not true, right? Just deal with the reality of the situation that they have in the short and long term, your data or your direct messages, and pause and get some help.
Right. And this isn't just Miriam and Brian giving this advice. The FBI has actually put out a public service announcement on exactly this topic, and we'll include a link to that in at the end of this session. But that is exactly it's the advice from the FBI saying exactly what we're saying, right? Which is don't
Mhm.
engage, don't pay, call law enforcement, call somebody you trust, right? But engaging and paying are not going to lead to the conclusion that you want. Because the other thing to know is they didn't get into your personal computer. They didn't get into your phone. So the allegations about the sextortion, particularly, or any other private information that wasn't in Canvas is just a lie.
Mhm. Yep. And Miriam, let me double down. I think that is a really important message for the audience. What we know today, right, is that what was compromised was in Canvas only. It did not have downstream impact to personal email addresses, to personal computers, to phones. Now, with that said, one of the most important things you can do right now, if you're in the audience, is to change your passwords on all your personal accounts, enable multi-factor authentication on those accounts, because it is obviously possible that the actors have access to some of your personal communication information, and you want to take the right steps to protect that. And Miriam, before I forget, I do want to talk about online identity or identity fraud against minors before we move on, if
No,
that's
please,
okay.
please go
Yeah.
for it.
So we talked about extortion, everything from, you know, content in direct messages or making claims that there's compromising pictures or videos, and like that is here and now and very, very relevant for anyone who has had data stolen. As we look forward, just say 6 months, 12 months, another massive risk is identity fraud, right? Because there is enough information about each of the students in the data that was stolen that it's very, very easy for these actors to open up fraudulent credit cards, right? Or fraudulent bank accounts. And so it is very important that the audience also pays attention to credit monitoring services and things of that sort, because this is how the data gets used to further illicit schemes, not only for shiny hunters, but for other affiliates that shiny hunters sells the data to. So Miriam, I just wanted to hit that
Yeah.
point.
No, and particularly for people under 18, right? You can't get a credit report if you're, I mean, it's very hard to so what we have seen happening is people's kids turn 18, they get their first, free credit report from the credit bureaus and find that their child is, $500,000 in debt, even though they've never done anything. And so I think it's a really, really good point that particularly for minors, this is one of the ways in which the bad guys are exploiting this kind of information is by
Yep.
opening up opening up various credit facilities and then doing that in the name of the minors, and nobody's checking because they can't.
Yep.
All right, so Brian, what haven't we hit? I think
I think we've hit everything.
the only other thing just to hit is
Yeah.
just to make the point which you made, which is despite the fact that Shiny Hunter said they wouldn't compromise, wouldn't extort the schools, we are seeing some evidence that the schools are being extorted. And so if you're a school, there are lots and lots of resources for you within your organization, with the lawyers, talk to your office of general counsel, talk to law enforcement, make sure that you guys are being very thoughtful because again, paying is likely to not have the data, the data is not going to be deleted because they've already broken their word once, they're going to do it again. So just be very thoughtful about how you engage, whether to engage. And law enforcement actually really, really can be incredibly helpful in this context.
Yeah. Yeah, Miriam, I guess if you give me an opportunity to just sum this up in like
Please.
three key takeaways, right? Um, the scope of the data is massive in terms of traditional personally identifiable information, all the way through fantastic context for the cyber threat actor, shiny hunters, right? And that enables very, very specific and capable spear phishing, extortion attempts, right? Online identity fraud, et cetera. That's number one. Number two is Shiny Hunter's MO historically and probably presently is that they will keep a copy of the data and they will try to extort individuals moving forward. And so any trust in the fact that this is going away is misplaced trust, and vigilance is extremely important. And then number three is just that, like self-awareness, vigilance for the individual, right? The individual student, the individual faculty member to pay attention to emails, text messages you're getting. If Miriam raised the concern about not getting credit reports under the age of 18, which is very true for those of us over the age of 18 by a lot, like myself, right? Like we should be monitoring those things very, very rigorously. And so that's how I would break down like the three key takeaways: the scope of what was stolen and what it enables, Shiny Hunter's historic and present MO, and then vigilance moving forward.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Brian.
Yep. Thanks, Miriam.
I would, before you leave, I'd love to ask one question here.
Sure.
And that is basically the ability to roll up data from multiple sources. So if I have all the Canvas data, one of my concerns would be that makes me easy to identify on TikTok. That makes me easy to identify on Instagram. So now you start rolling up more data to even make a stronger pitch. I have these pictures from you at this party. I can kind of connect through. Is that something that you're seeing or something that people should be worried about that's even a better spear phishing attack? Because I know.
Miriam, I can take that if you want me to.
Go ahead.
Please.
Wayne, I think that so the core answer to your question is yes, right? Okay, that's the answer. Let me try to put some context around that. The ability to aggregate data, right, with machine learning and AI is obviously at scales we've never seen before, right? So that aggregation of data to tell a more fulsome story at an individual level is obviously very real, very present, and that's why I say the answer to your question is yes. But it also, like my takeaway or my guidance to the audience would be this. This is why it's so important to monitor all communications coming into all of your direct messages, to your email box, to your phone, right? It's not just email or phone, and if I wasn't clear on that, that's me, but it's all of your communication accounts, all of your social media accounts. So the core answer to your question is yes. I just think everybody needs to take a broader view of how to protect themselves.
Yeah, and I'll just add, look, Shiny Hunter says 270 million records already. Can they aggregate it? They can also not only aggregate it with other kind of public stuff, but they have other companies and organizations that they've compromised. So particularly, like they may have different methods. So for students, they may just use what's in Canvas and make some stuff up like we talked about. But for example, a senior faculty member, at a university, they could take the information from Canvas plus other information and make that, a pretty scary extortion attempt. We have seen from other shiny hunters compromises. So cruise lines and other organizations, and they're very good at creating concern from the recipient. And that's not just for the kids, right? That's for sophisticated, grown-ups. But you're absolutely right, Wayne. It's a great point.
Well, I want to thank both of you for sharing this information. Being at a university, you worry about the students and what they're doing, and being a father of a high school kid, I worry even more there because they don't hear this kind of information. They don't have access to it sometimes, and sometimes the families don't. So what you're doing is a great service. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Wayne. Thanks, Miriam.
Thank you.